ask you the uncomfortable dimension of that internationalist nationalism. India is a sovereign state. Mm-hmm. At some point, it may be compelled to use force to defend its interests. There is a vast area of cooperation, mm-hmm. which you've elaborated. But as a state in a competitive state system, you cannot renounce the use of force. You cannot, right?
And we haven't.
So can you talk about how you imagine, what India imagines the legitimate uses of force to be? And as India grows in power, what would be the parameters with respect to the use of force?
You know, it's a subject, it's actually a scenario with which we have been very cautious. We have been very cautious because if you look at the history of the last 75 years, mostly this country has used force defensively when it is threatened, almost always within its own borders. Okay, there's no problem with that. You know, tomorrow if the country is threatened, we will use force. There's no ambiguity there. The issue, in a sense, you're raising is application of force outside your national jurisdiction. We've had relatively limited experience of that, one of which was in Sri Lanka in 1987. I myself was with the peacekeeping force for 2 years. I can tell you it was a very, very difficult, very troubling, and a very, at the end of the day, a very counterproductive exercise. And that did scar, you know, policymakers for a generation.
Yes.
Okay. Don't get sucked into endless open-ended commitments. It's not unique to us. Other countries have had their versions of it. Overall, I would say countries tend to be cautious. There are some, like the United States, which, to my mind, are truly an exception. You know, I don't think the U.S. can really serve as an example for anybody else. It is a sui generis case. But most countries today would be very, very cautious about the use of force outside. They would like to keep it targeted. They would like to keep it, in a sense, very purposeful. And they would avoid getting sucked into something which they cannot see. Now, having said that, if you ask me, so where do I see this going? I honestly cannot answer that question, because if you were to ask me when I entered the Foreign Service, where would you see India in the next 45 years? I wouldn't have imagined I would be where I am. I wouldn't have imagined the world today which I see around me. So, since the pace of change is quickening, but I would say this, that for a country like India, our interests are growing. The fact is the global environment today makes it more and more necessary for countries individually or in combination to secure their well-being abroad. So it's not like somebody else is going to do it for you. I think that expectation is less with each passing day. So if you take more capability, less global assurance, continuing, if not greater, competition, I think there will be situations which this country will have to face. But I can't really explicate on that. But it's certainly something which will be in our thoughts.
So let me end this conversation where we began, where we were talking about partnerships. And I asked this question primarily from the perspective of my own country, because that has been a truly transformative and novel development between the United States and India in the last 20 years. When you talk about partnerships, very often our experience is to use the words, but imagine that means something like an alliance. What would you educate us with respect to the distinctions between the two? When you think of partnerships, what do you mean? Because you know the history of American alliances, you know the history of American expectations about alliances. How far can we go in this bilateral relationship without it becoming the alliance which I suspect India wants to avoid, no matter how close it comes to the United States?
You know, not confusion, but the synonymity between partnerships and alliance is particularly and peculiarly American. And there's a very good reason for it. The reason for it is American history. So when you look around the world, because you have alliances, you have bilateral treaties, so you have, you know, for you, when you say partnership, partnerships for you mean treaties and means alliance. Okay. That is something which simply doesn't harmonize with where India is coming from. We are a post-colonial society, very fiercely protective of our independence, wishing to maximize our choices, as I said, expand our spaces. So a lot of the talking past each other, which we've had for some years, is because there is this habitual superpower and this idiosyncratic rising power. And they are saying sometimes the same things, but in their own minds, they mean different things. Now, what has changed? Because I have a concrete proof that there is change. That change, to my mind, is the Quad. That it's interesting, policymakers in America, people in administration, have understood this. You know, I get more grief from analysts. I'm not pointing a finger, but you know, from people in think tanks and you know, sort of the public space, about what their expectations and their definitions are of what a partnership is. You know, so it's like, how can India be a good Quad member if the Indian position on Ukraine is not identical with that of the United States? That was never the basis of Quad. So policymakers, you know, I don't have a problem, you know, talking to and interacting and explaining and dealing with the administration. It's much more, it's the public space. You know, this happened to us in a way when the nuclear deal got done. The government was the revolutionary force. The public space actually lagged behind. And, you know, and was sort of constantly questioning the pace and direction of the change. To some extent, I would argue that's happening in the US today. That the administration has actually been very pragmatic, very understanding, you know, very much forward-looking about how to work with a country like India. And the Quad is very interesting because you know, the other three are treaty allies.
Right.
Okay. Right. For three treaty allies to work with a non-treaty, non-alliance country is a novel experience for us as it is for them. So we are all having to change as we go along. I mean, we too have to, you know, sort of sometimes, shall I say, revisit some of our assumptions and try to figure out how this works. And the fact that the Quad has grown so much in the last 5 years, I think is a testimony, if I say so myself, to the creativity and to the far-sightedness of people in the governments of these 4 countries over the last 5 years. So, look, bottom line is this. I come back to my first answer.
Yes.
You know, when I said, to me, Indian foreign policy is about a relentless, unending quest to go up in the international order. And for me, sky is not the limit for that. And to do that, because I told you I have to harmonize my short term and my long term, I have to be very careful that the stresses and the challenges of the day do not fundamentally jeopardize my direction, my persona, my strategy, my sense of myself.
Yeah.
So I'm very much more confident in 2022 that this kind of working arrangement with a country like the US, because Japan and Australia in a sense are much more narrow in how they are plugged into. It is America which has a global vision of
Yes.
alliances.
Yes.
And to some extent, I would say the critical inflection point where the events leading up to and the nuclear deal itself. But look at what has happened after 2005.
Yeah.
So if you were to ask me, saying, okay, in these years, what has been the really remarkable change in how India views the world in terms of relationships? I think there's no question it's our relationship with the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a wonderful place on which to end this conversation, because there is reason for optimism at both ends. I mean, the United States, and I see Lisa here, who played a critical role in
I was looking at her when I was saying some of the nice things.
Yeah, and well deserved, well deserved. The example of the Quad is really that great manifestation where the US is now learning to deal with institutional arrangements that are not natural to itself. And the fact that India is now very comfortable with that close relationship with the United States, despite the absence of an alliance, I think augurs very well for the future. So let me thank you, Minister, once again for spending time with us this evening. And I believe the next item on our agenda is that you actually formally release the book. So we will go through, the ritual of bringing up the books to you. And I would like to invite my co-editors to come to the podium as well. And then we can proceed with the actual ceremony. But thank you so very much.